Good morning, good afternoon and good evening. I'm Lynn Robinson, Director General of the IIC, and I welcome you to day 2 of the Brussels Telecommunications and Media Forum. We commenced day 1 with a keynote speaker and 4 excellent sessions who focused largely on networks and competition themes. As we move into our second day, we're looking forward to taking a closer look at digital services. We will start by hearing about the activities of New Zealand's Office and Film and Literature Classification. However, before we start this first session, I would just like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Frontier Economics and Bird & Bird, for their support, which is very much appreciated. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Camilla Bastani, Director International at Ofcom UK, who will be in conversation with Chief Censor David Shanks. Welcome, Camilla and David.
Thank you very much, Lynn. It's a pleasure to be here today and a real honor to be sitting on this side of this conversation with David Shanks, who has one of the best titles of any regulator in the world as Chief Censor. David, let's get right into it. I'm sure a lot of people are wondering what the Chief Censor does. So tell us a bit about the Chief Censor's office. What do you do? What's the scope of your activities?
Good morning, Camilla. Great to be here. Yes, Chief Censor, it is a great title, isn't it? Something of an overhang from an earlier era, I feel, but you know, who knows, perhaps coming back in vogue. Look, in terms of what the Classification Office does, what the Chief Censor does, I'm effectively the chief executive of an independent Crown entity called the Classification Office. And this office, in the context of Aotearoa, New Zealand, forms one of a patchwork quilt of media regulators. And in common with many jurisdictions around the world, we have a set of regulators really configured and designed for quite a different media landscape and quite a different era. We have an advertising standards authority, a broadcasting standards authority, a media council, formerly a press council, an online harmful digital communications agency, and so on. Quite a common picture, I think, around the world as you look at how regulatory systems and processes kind of grow up, start overlapping, and all meet and intersect in the online environment increasingly as things converge. And the Classification Office, I think, is relatively unusual as I look at similar regulatory authorities around the world, in that the office is configured to deal with both commercial content, so films. It was originally, in fact, formed in response to the perceived threat of a new technology, VHS tapes, that were becoming quite controversial in the late 80s. And my office was formed out of combining 3 previous authorities: Indecent Publications Tribunal, a film censor, and a VHS tape authority. We had a specific regulator to deal with the VHS industry. And the concept was that the Classification Office would deal with commercial content like VHS tapes or DVDs, cinema release films, but also Crown content, so material referred by law enforcement agencies such as police or our Department of Internal Affairs, which conducts investigations into matters such as child sexual abuse material and the like. So effectively, the role spans that commercial and, if you like, dark side of the internet in terms of content. And there's a few features about the office that are quite unusual, that have given us an opportunity to think about what a modern digital regulator might look like. So for one thing, our Act, even though it was drafted back in 1993, right at the dawn of the internet, our Act does encompass any publication, and a publication is defined very, very broadly. So previous chief censors have censored T-shirts, a deck of playing cards has been classified and censored by a predecessor. I, in fact, have classified a camper van. So anything that has imagery or text or audio in any media, including digital media, is covered by the Act. And that means essentially any publication on the internet, such as an online social media post, a video clip on YouTube and the like, is also potentially covered by the Act. And in addition to that, as Chief Censor, I have a own motion power, a call-in power, so I can call in and classify something that I consider may present a harm or be injurious to the public good. And that provides an interesting avenue to think about harm and the internet, but is challenging when you think that 500 hours of content is going up on YouTube every minute, 500 hours a minute, so what do you do with the call-in power in that context? Well, it has given us an opportunity to think through how we apply our limited resources. It's a small office, just over 20 people, but it has given us an opportunity to think about how we can leverage our reach and our influence and our statutory authority in that sort of environment. Just finally, I'd say we have a research function which is really critical for us in terms of actually learning our way forward in the digital space. And what we're seeing now is, I think, the circle closing in terms of new technologies and challenges really forcing a review and a think about, well, do we have the right configuration? Do we have the right regulatory structure? And just like back in the early 90s, I think new technology is forcing a reconsideration of the whole landscape. And we have a content regulatory review, a broad span review underway right now, looking at those sorts of issues.
So many questions popping up in my head in response to that. Particularly interesting to consider, 500 hours of content on YouTube a minute. Obviously, you don't have 500 camper vans being kind of built and painted and roving around a minute. It's a very different scale of challenge, isn't it? I mean, what is your view? You mentioned that you're thinking about the sort of adaptations that your office needs to make in order to engage with the sort of the different nature and scale of the content challenge. What kinds of things are you thinking?
Well, part of the issue, as you point out, is volume. Whenever you're talking about regulating content on the internet, one of the fundamental challenges is how can you eat that elephant? How can you begin to deal with the sorts of volumes of material that you're talking about? So, and there's no easy answers to that, but I think there are ways that you can start breaking it down. And one of the approaches that we have been putting into place just recently is in relation to a part of the internet being streaming video on demand services, the likes of Netflix or Amazon Prime and the like. So that came up some years ago as a particular critical area of concern. It was that whole industry was unregulated in New Zealand, and there was particular issues around the broadcast on Netflix of the teenage suicide drama 13 Reasons Why. Now, New Zealand has one of the highest, if not the highest, rates of teen suicide in the OECD. And there was significant public attention and concern around the potential impacts and harms of release of that show. And in fact, I did an informal survey of several hundred teenagers who I was speaking to at cinema film events that we run with schools as an education program, and asked several hundred 16 and 17-year-olds how many had seen that show, and virtually all of them put up their hands. It was a massive hit, huge engagement. So, but thinking through our approach to how you go about regulating streaming content, it's a similar volume issue. You know, there's much more material going up on your typical streaming service than we could deal with by doing an analog review classification ahead of time. And the time scales that apply for cinema release content or the like doesn't really apply or work in the same way. So we've developed online tools and a self-rating, self-classification process where we can effectively certify a Netflix or an Amazon in terms of their own self-rating system that delivers a consistent approach to what we would expect if we were doing it ourselves. And that's an approach where I think you're going to see significant development internationally over time in terms of warnings and age rating classifications and the like. So that's just one area and one part of the internet where you can think differently from your traditional analog process and make quite a transformative change.
That's really interesting. It's the sort of the first frontier, isn't it? The sort of commercial content on the internet, in this case, commercial subscription VOD services. I guess much more challenging is the non-commercial, the user-generated content, where the idea of having a self-certification system is probably not so realistic. And obviously there we have a different set of challenges, don't we? It's a sort of combination of, it's not just a question of setting the appropriate age threshold for the content, but also this sort of, you've got obviously illegal content, of which, you know, New Zealand has particular very, very tragic experience with, and the sort of amorphous concept of legal but harmful content, which obviously raises a number of other challenges. So talk to us a little bit about whether what the different challenges are posed by these two different categories of content, and whether you think they warrant the same kind of approach from a regulator or different.
Yeah, look, there's so much to that, and I mean, I think a traditional regulatory approach in this space will always drive to the illegal. So what I've seen time and time again is discussions around regulation in this area fundamentally getting, you know, the gravitational pull seems to drag everyone to really focusing on where the thresholds are for illegality and whether they need to be changed and so on. And I think that is an important consideration, but far more important in my view is the thinking about how you engage with harmful material that may be lawful. You know, so the classic kind of high water mark for illegal content around the world is child sexual abuse material, and that's the area where you'll find the greatest international level of commonality of approach, and understandably so. Beyond that, though, there's quite disparate approaches in terms of what terrorist promotional material might reach that bar, what sort of crime instructional material, you know, there's significant differentiation around the world in that area. And that's definitely something that needs to be paid attention to. And everyone needs to think through what their current settings are, whether they're correct and so on. But an example of the challenge of lawful but potentially harmful content that I think is really quite evident given the experience of the last 2 years is seriously misleading and potentially harmful misinformation. So when the pandemic started rolling across the globe in in 2020, I started talking to colleagues in regulatory agencies to say, I think we are really going to struggle in the face of very significant mis and disinformation and conspiracy theories off the back of this global pandemic. And verily that has come to pass. When I started talking to people about my concerns in this area, I couldn't possibly anticipate that we would be seeing conspiracy theories saying that this was an engineered organism to basically create a pretext so that the globe would be vaccinated with a vaccine that contained nanobots that were activated through the 5G networks so that their brains would be controlled. But, you know, we saw that exact conspiracy theory brew up on the internet very, very quickly early in 2020. And very soon after that, I found myself watching a Facebook clip with some of my people, who had videotaped themselves or filmed themselves and put up on Facebook, I think it was, a video of them setting fire to and attacking a cell phone tower. It wasn't even a 5G cell phone tower. The 5G cell phone towers are quite small. So they're attacking an old style cell phone tower. But that to me was a really graphic example of how something, you know, a conspiracy theory like that seems kind of ridiculous and not necessarily harmful, and certainly not something that you would apply the, you know, criminal sanctions to or prohibit. And yet it led very, very quickly to a series of attacks on cell phone towers in this country and elsewhere. So in our view, you've got to be thinking about that knock-on effect of harmful material that could lead to, in our view, the production of material that captures a crime, that drops it into our potential, you know, review and classification. So you need to be thinking about that material that is lawful but might present harms. And how do you think about what you do in terms of mitigating the harms of that material? Well, part of it is counter speech, or, you know, identifying harmful propositions, harmful ideologies, harmful theories, as in this case, and figuring out how you can reach those communities who might be susceptible to those harms, and providing them with some kind of balancing, hopefully accurate information. That's one method. Another method is to be thinking about, well, actually, what could we be doing to reduce the vulnerability of those communities in the first place? And that takes you to education and tools and information. Other things you can think about is, and this is going to become a critical part of the debate now and into the future, is what is the responsibility of the platforms themselves who are propagating this material or allowing it to propagate. So we know that recommendation engines and algorithms on most social media platforms will elevate high engagement material. Now, wild and you know, kind of extreme conspiracy theories are high engagement material. Even if it's people like laughing at them and turning them into memes, it's people will engage with it, and it'll be selected for, and it will be very visible and prevalent. At the same time, most of the major platforms will have policies in place saying that they will not they'll not tolerate harmful anti-vax misinformation, for example. And I think the evidence is coming through increasingly clearly that there's a disparity between the policies that platforms say they have in place or will even publish, and their enforcement of them. So there's avenues there to think about, well, how can we work on that avenue?
That sounds very familiar. As you know, the online safety regime that has recently been published as a bill in the UK is very much based on this idea that the platforms need to be held accountable for complying with their own policies, with their own terms and conditions. And it proposes a system that Ofcom would be responsible for playing that role. And I wonder what you see in terms of the future of your office, moving from a sort of assessing individual pieces of content approach to playing a role where you're assessing, I guess, what we would call the systems and processes of the platforms, to almost take a bit of responsibility themselves for the dissemination and amplification of the harmful content. Is that where you see the future lying for yourselves as well?
Look, absolutely it is. And I don't think even necessarily that's the future for my office. That's probably the future for a new regulator that comprises my office and other existing regulators, just as there was a rationalisation of regulators in this country back in the early 90s. But that is mission critical, and it's key, I think, to making progress with engaging with the challenges that we see. You mentioned, you alluded to the fact that New Zealand had, quite a tragic history or experience in terms of dealing with online harm and digital harm, and it's worth just referencing the fact that, as some will know on this call, back in March 15, 2019, an individual carried out a horrific terrorist attack on 2 mosques in Christchurch here in New Zealand, killing 50 innocent people in the most grievous way, while filming filming the murders using a GoPro and live streaming that to Facebook. And what happened in the course of that attack and the propagation of that video footage to the internet was that a relatively small group of supporters or people who believed in the white nationalist extremist ideology of this attacker online were propagating that video across all of the major platforms, and the result was that video went viral here and overseas and was watched by many people. In fact, it was being recommended to view on children's cell phones in this country. There were people lying on the floor in their schools in lockdown, concerned that the attack might be going broader across Christchurch, terrified and looking at their phones, watching the live stream of that attack. So, absolutely the most horrific online harm event you can imagine, virtually. But one of the experiences for me was contacting several of the major platforms afterwards and asking them, well, so you've published a few weeks after the event, there was public comment by many of the major platforms who have been caught up in this, and there was a lot of discussion around how many versions of the video they had taken down off their platform. And I asked the question of several of the major platforms, well, that's great, but can you tell me how many times the video was actually viewed on your platform by New Zealanders? Because I'm thinking about a mental health response. I'm thinking about trying to assess how much harm was actually done, particularly to young people, and what's at stake here. And without going into details, the responses were very poor, in my view. And it highlighted for me something that's been raised with me multiple times by other regulators in other contexts, which is there is massive information asymmetry between regulators or state actors or researchers or anyone trying to actually understand what's going on here and what the facts are, and the platforms themselves, who are the gatekeepers of what is going on within their platform. And I very strongly feel that there's a lot of work to be done here, but we can't even really start on that work in a meaningful way until we start addressing that information asymmetry and start getting clearer about what is the nature and scale and propagation of the harms, so that we can apply our efforts accordingly. So until we've got regulatory frameworks in place that can address that, I think it's very difficult to get too advanced in terms of your frameworks and scaling to address the harms.
That also resonates very strongly. I think the UK's Online Safety Bill and the European Digital Services Act regimes, they both have as sort of their centerpiece this greater transparency. Transparency for regulators, obviously, that's the sort of the first thing you'd think of, but also transparency for the users, for the wider public, and even discussions of greater transparency for third sector researchers, etc. And I just wanted to sort of pick up on that a little bit, because, you know, going back to the question of just the scale of the challenge, right? And even if you were to combine with other New Zealand regulators and increase the size of the regulatory function from 20 to 100, it's still a massive challenge. And I think in the UK, certainly, we're thinking a lot about the kinds of partnerships that we can engage with other researchers, with people who have been working in these areas, studying the harms, studying the commercial practices, in order to sort of address the information asymmetry that you mentioned, which is not just a data asymmetry, but also a kind of understanding asymmetry, right? So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that, in terms of what experience have you had to date working with other organizations that have an interest in this space, and have you found that, and where do you see the future of that?
So making progress in this area, given the scale of this challenge, as you outline it, it's a team sport. So this is not something that any one agency can execute on. You're never going to have the capability, the research reach, the level of understanding of all the multiple dimensions of this as one agency, unless you're constantly reaching outside yourself to researchers, to other regulators, and to your communities who you're trying to serve. So we've formed quite a significant network of experts, researchers, people active in thinking through policy responses, and gaining information in the policy space and the research space. But I would say one of the key kind of developments that we put in place several years ago was forming a youth advisory panel, just of a dozen really active, engaged teenagers here in New Zealand, where effectively I said, look, a lot of what we're supposed to be doing is aimed at, you know, protecting and helping children. But, you know, has anyone asked teenagers actually what they need, or what they think about these issues, or where they're seeing the harms? You know, we're constantly in a process of projecting our view as regulators, or, you know, as subject matter experts, on where the effort needs to be applied. But we're doing this in order to help the public and to help vulnerable communities, and actually make this whole system work better across a broader span of people. And we have no hope of doing that, in my view, unless you're actually getting out there and figuring out ways to engage in a trusted and open way with the communities that you're there to serve. So our youth advisory panel is the closest thing I have to an independent board, advisory board, helping shape our research program, where we apply our effort, what sort of resources we develop to help young people and parents and teachers and the like. So, you know, I think you can spend a lot of time in darkened rooms trying to work this out yourself. that could be spent much more productively by figuring out how you can get out there and engage and hear people's stories and use that as the key input to figuring out your work program and where you apply your effort.
I like the expression that it's a team sport, and I think it's not just a team sport at the national level, as you've just described, but I think it's a team sport internationally. In other words, I think a substantial degree of international cooperation is really required. Largely, we're talking about the same platforms operating across the world, you know, the same types of challenges arising, even if you set the bar at different places for what constitutes terrorist content or what constitutes hate speech. I think the existence of those categories is global. You know, the kind of regulatory tools that we might need to use will be, I think, common across the board. So I think there's definitely a major scope for collaboration across boundaries. I just want to take this idea of working with the constituencies that you're concerned about protecting. And I think that's really interesting, because I think the debates around online regulation often get focused primarily on the regulation of supply. So you're thinking about what interventions can we impose on the platforms themselves, what obligations can we impose on the platforms themselves. But particularly given, as we were saying earlier, the scale of the challenge and the breadth of the challenge, frankly, and the fact that our interaction with digital platforms is pervasive across our entire lives. It's not just like watching TV, that's one activity. It's literally us as a consumer, us as a patient, us as a professional, as a parent, right? So as a citizen. So I think, you know, certainly in the UK, we think a lot also about what needs to be done on the user side. So are there any interventions that we can do on the user side to empower users and make them kind of partners in delivering the policy objectives? So we're thinking things like media literacy. We've got a Making Sense of Media program in Ofcom. But I just wondered, from your perspective, from your experience, what role do you think there is for, well, media literacy, but also school curricula, working with educators, working with the Department of Education? Do you see scope for that in this space?
Yeah, I do. And in fact, I don't think you can succeed without factoring in exactly those elements. So when I started as chief censor, which was back in 2017, I was fortunate enough to go to an international classifiers conference in Stockholm in Sweden. That was actually, by the way, where I learned how challenging and confronting the title chief censor was, because I'd introduce myself to colleague, you know, leads from agencies around the world, and I'd say, "Oh, hi, I'm chief censor from New Zealand," and people would actually kind of recoil and take an involuntary step back, and I went, "Oh, that's kind of interesting." And then I was actually presenting at that conference, and I said, "So, just checking, is anyone here?" And there was people from classification authorities all around the world, and I said, "Has anyone here got a role called the censor or the chief censor, or has censorship in the title of their organization?" And one hand went up. It was a woman from Singapore, and she said, "Oh yeah, we've got censorship in the title of our organization, but we're going to change that in 3 months, so you're the last one." But in that trip, I had the opportunity to visit the Swedish Media Council, and they were showing me modules that they were producing for the Swedish education system, which included modules like how to identify propaganda, and unpicking what propaganda was and how people use propaganda and the psychological techniques used to manipulate and shift your opinion. Really, beautifully constructed little modules that could be used in the Swedish education system. And I was going, man, imagine if they've been doing this for 10 years in New Zealand or the US or a number of other places where propaganda might be seen as a growing problem. It's a growing problem around the world. surely we should all be thinking about what we can do to better, equip our young people and our workforces of the future and our communities of the future to be able to identify efforts to manipulate them and control their views and use their emotions against them. So yeah, that was a very early experience that led on to a bunch of thinking that we did off the back of research that we conducted into the effects of online pornography in teenagers. For example, we did research studies where we surveyed nearly 1% of the 14 to 17-year-old age group in New Zealand about their experience of and concerns about online porn. And that led to us, okay, so we've got some insights and we've got some young people's voices, and we've got a far better understanding of what the world is like from their perspective in relation to this issue. But what do we do about that? And when you get to what you do about that, you start to realize that regulation, like the changing the law and the regulation and, age restrictions and online age identification and all of these things, they're part of a solution. But if that's all you are doing, you will fail for sure. That alone will not work. You've got to be thinking about, well, what's actually going on here? Teenagers are interested in sex and they're viewing porn for various reasons, but partly because of that natural curiosity, and they don't have a counter narrative about what sex is to the narrative that pornography is providing to them. And that creates anxiety, concern, and they're thinking about these issues. So just having a regulatory response is not going to fit that, is not going to meet that need and address that gap of having a counter narrative about sexuality, healthy relationships, and the like. You've got to be thinking about, addressing that. And then beyond that, you've got to be thinking about, the other issue is all of these teens are having this experience. They're often coming across pornography accidentally at very early ages, and they're never talking to their parents about it, and their parents are not talking to them about it. So how do we bridge that gap? What sort of tools and information can we provide to parents to actually equip them and make them feel that it's okay to reach out and to understand when it's appropriate to do that? So you start to realize, in thinking about that one small but complex area of online harm and regulation's about 10 or 20% of the whole picture. The remainder is tools and information, it's culture change, and it's education. And unless you're thinking across that span as an integrated strategy, you will fail. And every kind of aspect of online harm that we've engaged with since, it's been a very similar picture. You've got to be thinking across the board, and if you're only thinking regulation, it won't work.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it's interesting, you've sort of identified a number of other types of interventions, but you've mentioned now counter narratives twice, once in the context of the disinformation and now in the context of sort of sex education. And I think that to me kind of adds an additional piece of the puzzle that we need to engage with, I think, in dealing with some of these challenges, which is around media pluralism and ensuring that we have a healthy media sector which is providing high quality content to balance out the harmful content which is circulating. And so I wonder if I could just sort of bring us back to this question, which was quite alive, I think, when you were in Sweden, this idea of being a censor. But of course, it's not just about censorship, as you've made very, very clear. And freedom of expression is often the sort of identified as the unintended casualty of regulating for online harms, whether illegal or legal but harmful, particularly legal but harmful. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you, as the censor, keep freedom of expression at the center of what you do. And yes, over to you.
Yeah, there's so much to that. I mean, counter narratives are key, but how do you succeed with a counter narrative if you're not trusted? So, you know, how do you get a counter narrative to someone who's vulnerable to an anti-vaccine or a pandemic conspiracy theory, because they don't trust the government, so they're vulnerable to that sort of conspiracy theory? How does a government agency provide a counter narrative that that person's going to trust and believe? You can't. It doesn't work. You've got to think about how you can power up the communities and the whānau, the family around that person, you know, whoever, and maybe even their online communities that they trust. You got to figure out how you can get those messages through in a way that they can be contextualized and understood and accepted, and in a public service broadcast from the government to reach those sorts of people with that sort of harm profile is not going to work. And that takes me to the human rights aspect to this and the freedom of speech aspect to this, because essentially if you're running a platform that says we don't respect your rights and we don't respect your freedoms, then it doesn't, you can't you can't make any progress from that point because you're not trusted. So trust is an absolutely essential part of the picture. And I mean, we're seeing this play out in recent moves introduced in Russia, right? In terms of the Ukrainian war, where effectively they're saying, well, misinformation is a big problem in Russia, so we're going to impose very, very strong sanctions against anyone who's propagating misinformation. By the way, misinformation in this context is anyone who's disagreeing with the official line that this isn't a war or this is a special operation and so forth. You can't have trust and when you're trying to apply brute force kind of sanctions in this space. So respect for human rights and freedom of speech has to be absolutely hardwired into the system, and it has to be designed in at the regulatory design phase, and it has to be carried through right through the culture of the organizations that seek to apply it. And it has to be real. And one example of context in that space, so that's a huge part of what we do in the classification office. Is freedom of speech is absolutely critically important factor, and we'll only abrogate from that where we absolutely have to. And that creates a tension, but it's a tension we wrestle with every day. An example was an amendment bill was going through the New Zealand Parliament recently, which was going to provide some additional powers to me. It was following on from the March 15 attacks. And the bill provided for an internet filter, a mandatory filter for objectionable material. And I actually did a presentation, my submission to the New Zealand Parliament argued against that filter power and that proposition, because when we analysed it, it just did not have the safeguards, the freedom of speech protections and the freedom of expression protections that we expected to see built into any legislation that would impose anything as potentially significantly impacting freedom of speech as an internet filter. So we walked the talk in that context and presented that, look, we can see scope for this powerful tool, but powerful tools need to be actually framed up in as safe a way as possible. So that's the line you have to walk. Yeah.
David, I think we've just kind of running out of time, but I wondered if in sort of another 15, 20 seconds, you might have any final words for those of us who have yet to acquire and start to use powers for regulating for online safety, as someone who's been doing it for a while.
In 15 or 20 seconds, I'd say go for good. don't try and design the perfect solution. It doesn't exist. Try and make things better. Good is good. Go for good and learn in your efforts for going to good, and then you'll be able to make it better than that. So the environment we're in is so volatile, it's shifting so fast, it's technologically driven. It's not going to stop. You simply have to go for good and learn in that striving for good to make it better for the next iteration. So yeah, go for good.
Excellent advice. Thank you so much, David. It's been a total pleasure speaking with you. And I will hand over to Lynn.
Thank you, Camilla.
Many thanks, Camilla and David, for such a thought-provoking conversation, superb session. Thank you both.